Now, the thorny issue of the European Union's sanctions against Zimbabwe has again come to the fore at the United Nations General Assembly currently underway. During his address, President Cyril Ramaphosa renewed his call for the lifting of sanctions, saying they do not only affect Zimbabweans but also the neighboring countries. Ramaphosa's plea coming just days after the European Union announced its intention to suspend its financial support for the Zimbabwean Electoral Commission. This is over concerns about the recent general elections. For reaction to this now, I'm joined by Tatenda Mazarura. She is a communications manager in the Crisis in Zimbabwe Coalition. And Tatenda, good morning to you. Thank you very much for your time. Let's first deal with the European Union's intention to withdraw funding for the SADC. For those people who may not have seen the statement from the EU, what are some of the reasons that they seem to be putting forward as to why they want to withdraw funding?
Thank you very much. Good morning to you and your viewers, and thanks for having me. As Zimbabweans, we are very disappointed, but obviously we're not surprised by the decision by the EU to suspend funding to the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission. This was based on the manner in which ZEC administered the recently concluded elections. The manner in which they did showed a lack of transparency and independence. And according to the EU preliminary report, they found out that the process violated human rights and fundamental freedoms of association, of assembly, freedom of speech. There was a lot of harassment and intimidation of civil society organizations and the opposition itself, and also just a general uneven playing field that was skewed in favor of the ruling ZANU-PF. So it is a clear indictment on ZEC and the way it administered the election, and a clear sign that it is working as an appendage to the ruling party. So it was on this basis and the basis that even other electoral observer missions, including SADC itself, also raised concerns. They specifically say that the elections undermined the Constitution of Zimbabwe, the Electoral Act, and the SADC principles and guidelines governing democratic elections.
Yeah. Have you...
So, in a nutshell,
I'm sorry to disturb. Finish your thought.
I was saying the manner it is not just the administration of the elections, but the legislative framework itself also undermined the credibility. You would realize that just before the election, Parliament passed the Patriotic Act, among other repressive laws that were aimed at shrinking or further shrinking the remaining civic space so that civil society would be gagged and not be able to call a spade, because we had been raising a number of issues and we had already dismissed the electoral process as flawed even before election day, based on our observation that there was a lot of harassment and intimidation.
Tatenda, I'm going to ask that we try and have quite a quick conversation because time is against us. So based on what the EU has put forward, and you've really just laid the ground for why it is justifiable for the EU to withdraw funding for the SADC, do you think that that's going to help change the manner in which it conducts elections?
Well, it must be understood that such support is extended to ZEC through the UNDP by the EU and other funding partners is not uncommon throughout the world. It is part of acknowledged efforts to strengthen democracy as submitted and acknowledged by most countries. So the suggestion that I've seen a lot of responses from ZANU-PF where they're dismissing EU and suggesting that this seeks to undermine the independence of election commissions. I think this is highly misinformed. If at all this was the intention of governments, they would never have signed up for such support. So we expect behavioral change from ZEC and ZANU-PF itself, but in 2028, EU will not be invited to observe elections in Zimbabwe. So we do not expect them to change unless everyone, all the stakeholders come together and actually encourage Zimbabwe to put its house in order. I'm happy that earlier on you raised the issue of President Cyril Ramaphosa, who keeps embarrassing himself at every international forum where he's behaving like President Mnangagwa's errand boy, talking about sanctions. If anything, the biggest sanctions that Zimbabweans are facing right now is ZANU-PF itself. So we expect ZEC to take this opportunity and utilize the next 5 years to put in place measures that ensure that come 2028, the elections are in line with not only our laws in Zimbabwe, but international standards and norms.
It's interesting that you've described the behavior, or should we say the statement of President Cyril Ramaphosa on an international platform such as the United Nations General Assembly. In your view, now that you've raised this issue, I asked the question during a very tragic incident of, I think it's the Albert Street, where 77 people were killed by a fire in downtown Johannesburg. And a good number of those people, we understand, were of Zimbabwean origin. And I asked the question to, I think it was a political observer, as to whether they think that the ANC and its government are complicit in Zimbabwe's excesses against its own people. I'm going to put that question to you. Based on what President Ramaphosa has done or has said at the UN, do you think that this country is complicit for why Zimbabweans see themselves where they are today?
Indeed, the ANC is very complicit, and we are very disappointed by such behavior. Instead of protecting its fellow revolutionary political party and their brotherhood in SADC, for the first time there was an opportunity to actually influence Zimbabwe based on the findings by the SADC Election Observer Mission to actually compel ZANU-PF to do the right thing and service its people. If you look at what is happening now, already Zimbabweans, there's mass exodus of Zimbabweans who are coming into South Africa, both legally and illegally, because they cannot survive another 5 years in Zimbabwe, where the economy is in shambles. So ANC continues to miss opportunities dating back to the era of President Thabo Mbeki, where there was an opportunity for them to assist Zimbabweans in rectifying and ensuring that there is legitimacy. Instead, they are enabling ZANU-PF to continue using unscrupulous means to hold on and cling on to power at whatever cost.
Now that we are on this political realm in this discussion, Tatenda, it leads me to ask you the question whether you think SADC leaders, you've already said that SADC found that the elections in Zimbabwe were not run in accordance with the rules of this particular body, the SADC region. But here we are, having had the inauguration of President Mnangagwa. President Ramaphosa was side by side him on the stage, and now he has gone to the UN to go and ask for sanctions against Zimbabwe to be lifted. Do you foresee a situation where the president of Zambia, Hakainde Hichilema, will most likely be ganged up upon or ganged up against by fellow SADC leaders because of the man he sent to Zimbabwe to observe the elections? What is happening as far as that space is concerned?
We have already seen ZANU-PF and its sympathizers attacking Dr. Mumba and President Hichilema himself, especially on Twitter, where they are dismissing the SADC findings and even saying this is a Western process. It is funny because how can a SADC initiative be dismissed as Western puppets who are trying to facilitate regime change in Zimbabwe? We would not be surprised if SADC gangs up against the SADC Troika chair, but we would be very disappointed. And we have already insisted as Crisis in Zimbabwe Coalition that the expectation now from SADC is that they immediately conduct an extraordinary summit to discuss Zimbabwe and facilitate a national dialogue that is inclusive of all key stakeholders, from the political parties themselves, the ruling party, the opposition party, civil society, and the church. All the necessary and key stakeholders must be brought to the table to discuss what should happen within the next 5 years so that we can have a transitional process that will guarantee the immediate facilitation of political and electoral reforms. We cannot another...
Tatenda,
yes.
Let me interrupt you.
Yes, sir.
Let me interrupt you because you're touching on very important elements here. Is it completely unforeseeable? Your expectations are that SADC must actually see to it that there is possibly a rerun of elections in Zimbabwe. But is it completely unthinkable, given what you have just said, that you seem to agree that President Hichilema might be put under severe pressure for Dr. Mumba's expressions of what has happened in Zimbabwe? Might you see a completely different thing playing out in Zimbabwe where, through SADC, that particular SADC Troika gives out a completely different statement, or perhaps even go back on some of the strong language they used in their observance of the elections? Do you think that that is something that is possible?
I do not think President Hichilema would retract, or even the SADC mission itself would retract, because they were very clear. Even the follow-up interviews that Dr. Mumba has had, he has emphasized that this was not a Zambian report. It was a SADC with input from all the countries that were represented in the mission. So we do not expect a retraction. What we expect is a facilitation of a national dialogue that will result in a transitional process that allows Zimbabweans to freely express themselves. I would also like to take this opportunity to also urge my fellow Zimbabweans. I know we have been killed in cold blood by the army. I know we have been intimidated, but this is a chance for us to come together and just protest and condemn this election. I think SADC has already set the tone for us. All SADC needs is our support and solidarity so that we can say enough is enough to ZANU-PF. They've caused immense suffering to the Zimbabweans, ordinary citizens of Zimbabwe. We deserve better.
Tatenda, Mazarura, thank you very much. Whoa, what a conversation this has been. She is the communications manager of the Crisis in Zimbabwe Coalition.